Responsive design inside Bubble can be sometimes a real pain in the ass. There are thousands of different screen sizes and types of devices, such as phones, tablets, desktops, and ideally, your app should work in all of them at the same time. But how can you make that happen, you might say? Well, you need to master responsive design. But don't worry, because in this video, I'm going to teach you how to use the responsive design features inside Bubble, one of the most popular and used no-code tools, with more than 3 million users worldwide. But before I jump into the content, I want to ask, are you ready? Hi, I'm Caio Calderari from automationhelpers.com. We help businesses like yours grow by using the best tools for automations, portals, integrations, and much more. Subscribe if you want to learn more about tech and automation. All right, it's tutorial time. Let's go. All right, I'm inside Bubble right now. If you don't have an account yet, just go to the website bubble.io and create a free one. Go ahead and create a new project from scratch and you'll be able to follow along with me. So there is really nothing here on this project. It's an empty project, and the goal here in this video is to show you how the responsive design features work inside Bubble. So the basic foundation here when we talk about responsive design is to understand how the page structure works and what is the difference between a page, a container, a component, and how to set up those little settings to make sure that everything works specifically the way you want, okay? Once I'm inside Bubble, I have this first page here, which is called index. That's the basic default page that I will ever get in any project I create here inside Bubble. Once I click the layout tab, I have the container layout feature option here, okay? So under this setting here, I have a couple options, and these options define how my page layout structure will work. So this is the basic foundation of responsive design. So let's give it a try, and I'm going to show you the differences between each one of these. Okay, so the first one that comes pre-selected by default every time you create a new Bubble account is the fixed option. Okay, so how does it really work? When we add components to our page, let's say I draw a button here, this element will stay fixed where I place it. So if I move it around, it will stay exactly where it's positioned, okay? If I drop a text field here in the middle of the page, it will stay right there. So nothing will really change because I'm using the layout option fixed. When I preview this page, the page will load, and as we can see, the elements will stay fixed, okay? If I reduce my browser window size, nothing will happen as well. They will stay fixed, okay? So this option here is not gonna allow you to build responsive designs because they will always stay fixed, okay? So whenever you want to build a responsive design layout here inside Bubble, you need to select other options, okay? Now, let's take a look at the second option here, which is align to parent. Once I do that, once I click here, the components inside my page will move, okay? Why is that happening? We have to understand a basic concept. A parent is the component that's holding other components inside it, meaning the components inside it will be called children, okay? So remember this basic concept. A parent is always going to hold smaller components, and the components inside it will be their children, okay? So once I change the container layout, since the container layout is the entire page, is the index page, it means the index page itself is the parent, And these components here, the button and the text, are its children. And the button and the text components inside the index page belong to the parent, which is the index container, okay? So once I'm using the align to parent option here, all the components that are inside this parent component will have its own settings once we click it. As we can see here, when I'm selecting the button inside the layout tab, we have a couple options here that we can change. Since I'm using the parent container option, it shows these arrows here that I can use to change the position. So if I put it in the center, it will go to the center. If I change it, it will match exactly the arrow side that I'm selecting. So this could be a good option to use when I have a layout that is going to be very simple. But that option is not always useful for building responsive design layouts as well, okay? So I recommend you go inside Bubble, give it a go, add some components to the page, and change things here so you can understand for yourself how this works, okay? The more familiar you get, the better it will be, and you'll be able to master all these features, okay? Here, when we are selecting the component, we have a couple other options. For instance, we have an option to make this element fixed width. In that case, this is selected, so it's not growing. If we deselect this option now, we have other options that are going to be exposed, okay? We have a minimum width, we have a maximum width, which is now not defined. And we have this other option here called fit width to content, okay? Meaning it will grow depending on the text you add inside it. If we uncheck this option, it will grow until it hits the limit of its parent, okay? In that case, it's the index page. So it will grow until it's no longer possible. Now, of course, our page as well has some definitions on itself. For instance, what is the default builder width? What's the minimum width? What's the minimum height? And so on. And here under the page settings, we also have some presets we can choose, like custom, full width, centered, or mobile. To be honest, I don't really use that very often, okay? So it's just good to know. Now, you can change the page size as well if you want to, but not always it will be necessary, so it's really up to you. But it's good to know the page size, okay? Now, if we click this button, for instance, let me remove the text. We can also see similar options here. Like we can make this non-fixed width. We can see the minimum width. We can see the option to fit width to content as well. We can remove that and automatically our button will be stretched. We can see fit height to content as well. Then it will stretch even more to the sides. And so we have a couple options here to control a lot of things, right? So how much it will expand. If there is no definition, it will expand until the parent's limit. But if you define a limitation on the component itself, then it's going to be a different story. So it's important to really understand this relationship between parent and between the children, okay? Because if the parent is not allowing itself to grow, then the children will not grow as well. But if the parent is growing, but the child is not, then you have to look into the child settings and change that. So once you understand the hang of it and you understand this relationship, things will start to work and you will be able to build amazing responsive design layouts, okay? Now we understand this option here, which is called align to parent. But as we can see, if we add more components to the page, for instance, if I add a text here, another button, an image, it will not look nice because each component has to be configured to go to a specific side and it's not going to be responsive as well. So that's another option we have available here, but in reality, it's not really that common to use this option, okay? Unless you have a very specific design layout that you want to build, and that for some reason, this option will be the best one. But in most cases, you're going to either be using rows or columns, okay? So let's jump right in and talk about rows first. Okay, once I change this container layout option to row, as you can see, all the components inside my page are being automatically reorganized, okay? Because now it's following this row order, meaning every component will be on a single row. So this is the first one here, the second one here, the third one here, the fourth one here, okay? Okay, so now we are in the row container layout mode, okay? So as we can see, when we have the row option selected, all the components will fall into a single row like we see here. If we copy a component, for instance, this group here, and we paste it on the page, since there is no more space for this component to fit here, it will fall into another row, okay? And if I keep adding components here, it will go to the same row and continue this behavior until we have no more space, and the next component that I add will go to the next row, okay? Now, if we change this to column, then it will do the same thing, but in an opposite direction. It will go to the bottom, okay? So these two options are the most common and frequently used when building responsive layouts, okay? So now that you understand this concept, we can take a look at other aspects of it. So under row here, we have this option called container alignment, meaning it will define how the components inside the index page, which is the parent, will behave. So if we select center, it will try to center all the components together in the middle of the page, okay? Still following the row that is the basic definition we have here. If we change this to the right, it will go all to the right. If we select this option called space around, it will create gaps and spaces between the existing components, still following the row approach, but it will add these spaces between each individual element, trying to divide the entire existing space for each individual component as much as possible, okay? If we preview this page and start squeezing the browser window, reducing the screen size, we can see that it's changing automatically because it's trying to fit the components inside the parent container based on the rules we defined previously, okay? So it's already responsive, but we haven't defined all the potential rules we can use here, okay? So that's a good start. Now, I have another option here, which is the space between. The difference is that instead of considering spaces around the existing components, it will just consider the spaces between them, okay? So that's another option, especially if you don't want to have gaps on the sides of your page, okay? So this is also a nice approach to use, and it's also a very common practice when building responsive layouts. Hey, if you need help building your custom project, or if you have any questions, we are here to assist. Visit our website at automationhelpers.com and book a free 30-minute consultation calls with our experts. I'm sure they will be able to help you get your project done. So don't waste this opportunity. Click the link down below and make sure to book your call today. Now, the same thing applies to the column option. If we change to the column option, we see that it will change the direction for each individual component, and we have pretty much the same options here available for us. And we also have an option that I haven't talked about yet, which is this option called apply gap spacing between elements. So if we use this option, we can define in pixels how much the gap will be. This could be another useful feature for you depending on the types of layouts you want to build. So now if we go back to the row option, once we click here to apply the gap spacing between elements, we not only have the row, but we have the column gap as well. So we can define even more specific settings here, okay? Of course, this could also be achieved by using margins and paddings within the actual components, okay? But that's just another option for you to know about. Now, if we click inside an existing component that is on a page, we can see we have a lot of extra options here, okay? So remember the relationship that I talked about, the parent-child relationship. So the parent is the index, right? And this one is a group, which is a child component inside the index page. But because it's a group, it can also hold other components inside it. Some components will allow you to place other components inside it. All these ones called containers will do it. But some other components will not. So buttons will not allow you to add other buttons or other components inside it. So there is a difference. So for instance, you can drag a button inside this group, and now what is going to happen is that this specific group becomes now the parent of this internal component that is a child component, okay? So the difference is that the containers have other options, like the page has this option here to select whether you want to use a row, a column, align it to the parent or fixed. The container inside the index page also has the same features because it is also a parent to the internal components inside it. Okay, so that's a very important concept to understand. Okay, so I'm going to click here to show you what I'm talking about. So we have the option column and row, and if we change this and change here, you're going to see that the component inside will also change, okay? So this first part here is basically the same we saw before when we were working with the index page, okay? But as we can see, we have a second section here with a lot more features. So it's really simple to understand. This first part here is about the parent container. So as a parent container, what can I define? You can define if it's row, column, the alignment. So all the children components will follow this alignment. And then you can control the gap between elements as well. This second part here is the relationship between this parent's component or container and how it will behave alongside with the other child components. So here, basically, what I'm doing is I'm defining, for instance, how this group should behave as itself, as part of this entire group that is the index page, and how it will interact with the other groups that are a part of this entire parent group that is the index page, that is holding all the other components, okay? So let's tweak a few things, and I think it will make more sense in a second. So the first option we have here is parent container type, okay? What is it saying? It's saying that this component here, which is the group, which is the one I'm selecting and defining settings for, belongs to a parent container which is right now set to row. If we click edit, it will take us back to the index page, which is the parent holding all the other components inside it. And it's defined as row at this moment, okay? Now, we need to click again here to go back to the original component we were talking about. And now we can see all the options we have here. For instance, we have vertical alignment. So we can change how it will try to behave inside this parent container. But the other components here and all the other rules applied to the parent will also define how much these options here will be applied or not. So if we say the vertical alignment is always to the top, it will always try to go up whenever possible. If we say it's centered, then it will try to find its position based on this definition. If we say it's bottom aligned, it will go to the bottom. And we have to understand like an imaginary line here. So this is the row, right? As we can see, the parent now is set as a space between. If we say, for instance, space around, or if we center everything, everything will change. And if we remove this gap here, everything will come together. So everything will change based on the parent's settings first. And once you start playing with the component itself, then you can change a few things. You can make it go to the center, you can align to the top, to the bottom, or even ask it to stretch, okay? And try to fit the entire row here that is available, okay? Now we have a couple buttons here that we can use to change the position of each individual child component. So let's say for some reason I want to send this group here. Instead of dragging it here, which can also be done, I could just say, hey, move this to the next position available, or move it to the bottom, to the last position, or move it to the first position, or just keep moving to the next until I'm happy with it. Another option, of course, could be to just come here, copy and paste, or drag these on a specific position here. It will also work. But that's just a nice feature you should know about. So that's how it works. Another option you have is to make this element fixed width, which in that case is not checked. Okay, so the minimum width is set to 200, so it's not going to go below that. But if I reduce that to 20, for instance, it will shrink. Why? Because since it's a row here and it's trying to fit all the possible components into the same row, whenever I make one component smaller, it will try to occupy this existing space if possible and bring the next component on the next row to the top, okay? Now, it's up to you whether you want to use minimum width or not, okay? Make sure that you understand the minimum mobile device that you want to target and then define these minimum widths on the parent or on the container or on the component itself to make sure it will not shrink until it breaks, for instance, okay? We have also the minimum height. We have this option to fit width to content, which means if there is something inside this component that is bigger than the actual minimum width, it will grow. For instance, this button here is a little bit bigger than this component is right now. So if I just copy this and paste it inside this container, now it will grow. Why? Because it will try to fit the width to content, okay? If I don't do that, it will kind of shrink the button, okay? Now, of course, the button also has some configurations inside it, so it will prevent it from getting way more squeezed, okay? So basically here, what you always have to have in mind and do is to check the parent first, then the container, and then the other component inside it. And then configure all these options to make sure you have the proper settings you're looking for to make your responsive layout work. Now we have a couple more options here like maximum width. Let's say we have a page where we want to have a container, but we don't want that container to grow too much. So we can define the maximum width, meaning it will only grow until a certain point or until a certain size. And we have some measurement options here. We can define it in pixels or in percentages, okay? We also have this option here to make this element fixed height in case we don't want to make this component grow based on its content. Let's say we have a text here inside a group. If we define a fixed height, it will not grow following what's inside it. It will just limit the content height to a specific height. But if we don't want that, if we want the container to actually grow, then it will grow based on what is inside it, and it will keep its minimum height if you set up 1. You can also remove. So you can always remove the minimum width, minimum height, or you can define maximum width or maximum height as well. You can define if the container will fit the content inside it, or if it will not follow the content, it will follow specific definitions. Let's say you have a container and you want to make it fixed. You define some pixels for the height, for the width, but you have text inside it that cannot be displayed with just this amount of height or width you defined. You can check this option and then it will create a vertical scrolling inside that container. So then you can actually see the rest of the text inside it without changing its size, okay? Now, we also have margins and paddings, okay? Margins are external gaps and spaces that you can add to a certain container component. And padding is the internal gap, the internal spacing you might want to add. So let's change things a little bit. Now, I'm going to change my index space to be column and the alignment will be to the top, okay? Now, imagine I want to build like a simple website. It's very common to have blocks, right? The first section, the second section, the third section. So as we can see, it's a bunch of stacked up sections. Basically the first one, then the second one, third one. So this is a column layout, okay, like we can see here. So imagine this is my first section, this is my second section, this is my third section, and so on. So another tip for you is when building websites, landing pages, basic page layouts, you're going to probably use column, okay? And it will be aligned to the top because everything is going to be always from top to bottom. So you don't have to overthink this too much. That's the pattern you can follow. So once we start building this page layout, we will be adding a couple containers here, probably groups. That's what I would recommend you use. And basically these groups will act like containers, will act like parent containers for the internal items we are going to add on that specific section, okay? So all we have to do is to click on a group and then we can rename it. If you like to keep things organized, you can call this, for instance, hero container. And as we can see, we have a few options here. So for instance, if I want this to stretch and occupy the entire page size, I can choose this option. And if I want to make this a fixed layout, meaning it will not grow and stretch to the edges of the page, I can choose the centered option and then basically remove this option to fit the width to content and add a max width here with the size of the grid you're going to use or the page layout you're going to build, okay? But basically, I don't really use maximum width most of the times, and I use this option here. And the minimum height or minimum width, it's up to you as well. Usually, I don't use minimum height as well, and minimum width only if I'm building for mobile. Then I usually set up something like based on the smaller screen size that I'm targeting, like 340 pixels or so. So that's up to you as well. It really depends on the type of layout you're building. Now, I would do this with all the groups here, so they all look nice and they look like sections. And then I would start building my layout structure inside these components. And if we preview that, we can see that it's fully responsive. Of course, we don't have a lot of elements here, but it's following the page. So that's the basic foundation here that we have to build responsive layouts. Now, the next step, of course, would be adding extra groups here. So I would create, let's say, another group here to hold, let's say, I will call this container left. Then I can duplicate this and create another area, another container here that will be the container right. Of course, this will depend on your page layout, but now let me just change the appearance here. I'm gonna add a flat color here so we can see it better. So this one will be a green color, and this one, let me detach the style, add a flat color, and choose another color here. Okay, so as we can see, this hero container now is the parent for these two other groups. And it's defined right now as column, right? So one is above the other. Now, if I change this to row, then it's going to be side by side. And then I can choose to center align these two. And now I have to click on each container and then define that it's not going to fit what is inside it. So it's going to grow, and this other one will grow as well. And they will divide the space here. Now, I can also choose to move these ones to the center here. So I can come to the vertical alignment here, and it will make both go to the center, okay? Now, of course, we have a minimum height on both of these containers. That's what is making it stay in that specific size. But once we start adding other components inside this one, it will grow. So for instance, if I add a text component here and a button, it will grow a little bit. If I add an image here, it will also grow. Of course, I need to add an image, so let me search for any image here quickly. So okay, I have a placeholder image now. My image is set to be fixed width. I'm gonna remove this. I'm gonna say it's 400 by 400 pixels so we can see it's growing now. It's much bigger, and the container is following its size, okay? Of course, I can make this image responsive as well, but right now I'm using this option here to expand it. I can also keep the aspect ratio if needed. Here I can click the text item. I can say it's fit width to content or not. So if not, it will grow and expand. I'm gonna show the element borders real quick here so you can see it better. I'm gonna change the text appearance and choose a style here. Let's say heading 1, so it's a little bit more visible. I'm going to change it to example text. And here for the button, I'm gonna change it to contact us. Now, let's say I want to add some space between the button and the text. I can use the margin, for instance, so I can add a margin bottom of 30 pixels. It will create this gap between these two elements. And now, of course, here, when I click the container, which is this green box here, I have a lot of options that I can choose. Now, one example that I can do here is to increase the height, for instance, so we can see some examples. So if I make this 600, right now the text is up top. But if I change this option here, it will go to the center or to the bottom, or it will be space between or space around, okay? So these are also options that you can use. Now, if I want to remove the minimum height, I can make this, let's say, 300 pixels, and I can come to the parent, which is the hero container, and I can say fit height to content. And once I do that, it will grow based on everything that is inside the parent container, okay? So as you can see, there's a direct relationship between the parent and the child component. Sometimes you're going to change things inside a child component. Sometimes you're going to change things on the parent. So that's really what you have to understand and get familiar with to build amazing responsive layouts using Bubble. If you liked this video, smash the like button down below, and also consider subscribing if you want to keep learning more about automation. Now, let's change the layout a little bit and give it a quick preview. I'm going to click here to remove this green color because I know it's a little ugly. And now let's preview and see what's going on. Okay, so as we can see, we have our parent container here, which is holding this first group, and this other group that holds the image, and we have a text and the button here. We don't have a padding here, so that's why it's very close to the edge. But as we can see, if we start to scale the page a little bit, it will shrink accordingly, okay? And it will try to fit both components inside the same space until there is no more room to keep reducing it, okay? Now, if we want to make this image go down below here to make more room for this text here to grow, we can define minimum width. So then when this component here gets to a specific size, it will stop shrinking, okay? Now let's go back here, and once we click the container left, and it's important to name your groups well, because sometimes it's going to be difficult to click the specific component you are looking for. For instance, here the image is not giving us any space to select the container. So it's good that we named everything correctly, so we can just click here to change how it works, okay? So we can click here on the name of the component we are trying to select so we can customize its settings, okay? Now let's select the container left, and what I'm gonna do is to add a minimum width of 340 pixels, okay? And as you can see, it's growing beyond what we want, so I'm gonna say fit width to content, okay? So it's gonna consider what comes first, either the content or the minimum width, okay? Now we can see that it's way smaller, right? So we can say, hey, do not consider the content width, consider this. And here we can check the container right. Since the container right has no minimum width, we can add 340 as well, and it will kind of divide the space here, because basically if you don't set up any setting, it will try to get more space than it needs just because the other component has no minimum requirements, so it will try to use as much space as possible. So if we preview it again, now they are kind of similar, and once we start reducing the page, they will stop shrinking and the other one will go to the bottom. Of course, we can define other rules to make that happen before or later. So we have other controls here that we can use under the conditionals. So if we want, for instance, to define specific rules here, we can create a condition that is based on the breakpoints, okay? Now, before I talk about it, let's go to the responsive tab. Inside the responsive tab, we have breakpoints, okay? So we have a default breakpoint, We have another breakpoint with 1200 pixels. We have one with 992, 768, and 320, okay? Now, once we change these breakpoints, we can see that the components will change accordingly. As we can see, as we start changing the breakpoints, the page will also change and behave differently. So this is a good way for you to test as well and see what things you need to change. For instance, I defined this container to be 340 pixels minimum width, and actually the breakpoint is 320, so I can come here and change that. And of course I need to check the internal components itself. So as we can see here, the image has a minimum width of 400, so that's important to notice. So if I define it as 0, then it will follow the parent component, okay? Now I'm gonna remove these other two groups here so we can see things better. So here on the image, we can change the aspect ratio if needed. We can reduce it, for instance, 320 to 200. Okay, so as we can see, the image now is set to minimum width of 0. We have to check the containers as well, so it's 320 pixels now. We have to check the other one. In this case, it's correct. Now, what is happening here? Because we have a 320 mobile device, but as we can see, this image is going a little bit off. Which one did we forget to check? Well, always check the parent. The parent is the hero container, which is also set to 340. So we are going to reduce it to 320. And that makes the text break a little bit, and then everything falls inside the container. Okay, so always remember this relationship between the parent and child components, okay? Now, we have a couple options here. For instance, this button here, we can make it stretch. For instance, if we add this option here as well, we can make the text stretch. We need some gap here. So for instance, I'm going to select the container left and add some internal padding, okay? So could be padding or margin depending on your layout style, okay? So if we add margin, for instance, 20 pixels top, 20 pixels on the bottom, 20 pixels on the left, and 20 pixels on the right, we are going to expose the background of the hero container because it's a margin, okay? Now, if I add a padding instead, then it's going to be added internally, okay? Another thing we need to consider is if I am adding a minimum width that is 320 and I'm on the smallest breakpoint, it will not shrink the component to add the extra margins you are adding. So you have to account for that. So if you want to add margins, you will have to reduce the minimum width to accommodate the extra margins you are adding, because margins are considered as part of the entire component size, okay? So I've added a couple internal paddings here, and because these components are not yet on their minimum width, in this case it's 0, in this case it's 60, because they still have room to grow, then the padding can still be added without impacting these rules, okay? Now, if I preview this, of course, on a bigger screen, it will look something like that. Okay, so if I start shrinking my page, as we can see, it will fall under the second line of this row, because remember, inside the container layout, we are using a row. And for the page structure, we are using sections as columns, okay? And it will all get very familiar and easy to you. The more you do it, the more you use it. Now, of course, we don't want this button to grow that big. So we can start defining some rules based on the breakpoint sizes. Now, another thing we can do is to use the Conditionals tab to change specific settings about a specific component. For instance, we can add conditional filters and rules to change how this component will behave based on a specific breakpoint size, okay? Just to give you a little example, I'm going to use this button, okay? So I'm going to click here, define a new condition, and once we click here, we can have access to this option here to start building our conditional rule, okay? So I'm going to click here and create a new one. So we are going to use the current page width as reference, and we have operators here, minus, equal, bigger than. So I'm going to say when the current page width, we can say, for instance, when it's bigger than the mobile breakpoint, and select that as our rule. So what we are basically saying here is when the current page width is bigger than the mobile breakpoint, which is this 320 pixels size, we can say do something on this specific element. So we can change a lot of things. We can change whether it's visible, we can change the minimum width, the maximum width, the margins, the paddings, and so on. So we're gonna make it smaller because it's growing right now, and it's okay for this breakpoint, but for the other ones, it's too big, okay? So to limit that from happening, and again, this is just one example, not the best scenario here for this button, but this is just one example for you to understand this concept, okay? So once we have this rule defined, we can say, for instance, the maximum width of this button will be 150 pixels. And once we go to this other breakpoint, as we can see, it's not shrinking anymore, okay? So this is a way to affect the behavior of a specific component and have more control while building responsive layouts, okay? Another option you have here is to add custom breakpoints. So if you click here, you can add other options here. Let's say something in between here. I want to create a breakpoint with 800 pixels. Now I get another breakpoint option here. So it's very customizable. You can create new breakpoints. You can even remove existing breakpoints or change their sizes. Of course, this is going to be a little bit more advanced, so I really recommend you only change that if you know what you're doing, okay? Now, I know that creating a responsive layout is not an easy task. I recommend you to start on a design tool first and design your layouts using Figma or any other design tool. And then you have the foundation of your layout and design to then start translating that into a Bubble application. Now, if you don't have design skills or if you don't want to start from scratch, I have a good news for you. Because inside Bubble, under this area here called components, you can find a lot of pre-made components that you can use, and they come responsive out of the box. For instance, I can find headers, and here I have a couple options here. If it's not allowing you to drag it over, you just click here to install the plugins required, and it will be enabled. Now you can drag all the options here to your page, and you have a full header here ready for you with your logo, some links, a CTA button, and you can continue and go even further, adding extra components to your page. You can browse other sections like this one, for instance. Make sure to select your page so you don't add extra components inside existing ones that you already have here. So you can drag this to your page. And then once you're happy with the layout you created, you can preview it. And it's all responsive, like I mentioned, out of the box. So you don't have to worry too much to build your next projects. And what I also recommend you do is to go to the responsive tab right here and check how it was built, because it will give you a lot of insights on how it was built. For instance, we can browse this group hero and see all the structure that they are using here. And we can also check if there are any conditional formulas. For instance, we have this rule here that's saying to change the bottom margin and top when the page is bigger than this breakpoint. We have another rule here, changing some left and right margins. And we can even check how the parent components were set up, and even consider copying this on the next projects you want to build. The more you play with it, the more you test things and even break things, the better it will get. So I really recommend you go inside Bubble, give it a try, fail sometimes, and keep learning. I hope you learned a little bit more about responsive design in this video, and if you did, let me know in the comment section down below. Now, if you want to keep learning more about automations, there are thousands of videos here on the channel for you to keep learning. So I recommend you watch this next one. And as always, let's automate your business.